it may also have been as early as 2013. Matthijs was as passionate about clean energy and about the need to do your math properly as I was. But while I was focusing on trying to assess the reality of molten salt reactor development, Matthijs was asking hard questions about materials use of energy systems. Earlier than anyone else I know, he became aware of the severe materials limitations that were looming in case humanity should one day become serious about building sufficient amounts of machinery to harvest renewable energies. The other day, on our national radio, I heard Ed Nijpels, who leads our national climate program, has recently been made aware of these materials limitations for the first time. Well, better late than never, but Matthijs was a couple of years earlier. I know only one person who can zap all over the place on Google Earth and dive into mining sites, the one mining site after the other, confronting you with the harsh reality of the materials aspect. As an example, tonight Matthijs is going to talk about just one of these essential metals, copper. How much do we need? How much are we going to need? And how fast can we get it out of the ground? And what difference does it make if we include nuclear, if we look at it from the materials perspective? Ladies and gentlemen, Matthijs Bekkers.
Thank you for that introduction, guys. Well, right here, there's a little introduction on the screen. As you can see, I wrote 4 books. I created 2 documentaries, and I have been engaged with basically explaining why we need nuclear. And I've been doing this, like I said, since 2012 and we met in 2013. So as you can see, I like to take my mind off things. So Star Wars is my getaway, because sometimes, it just becomes overwhelming to see what we are doing to the planet. So, why excluding nuclear from the taxonomy is unreasonable, and we are already hitting limits. So I want to preface this with the fact that we do need renewables, but it is unreasonable to exclude nuclear energy. So let's look at the problem from a very simple perspective. On the left-hand side, you see a house in the winter, and the people, they look at their electricity bill and they see that they have used up 3,500 kilowatt hours this year. And well, if you look at it from a personal perspective, and you look at your electricity bill, and you think, okay, let's slap 20 PV panels on our roof, and then our electricity problem is solved. If you expand towards, for instance, the Dutch perspective, from the perspective of an entire country, then you can see that 3,500 kilowatt hours is nothing, and that we use almost 1,000 times as much. So the problem is incredible. I said incredible. If you look at it from a planetary perspective, it even becomes much, much, much bigger. So let's get back to the Netherlands. We just zoomed out too quickly. We want to see, what is going on. The Netherlands is a quite energy-intensive country. We are in the top 10 of energy usage per capita, which means not just electricity, but also all the services that are available to us, building materials, the stuff you buy in the shops, you name it. So TNO, which is basically a research institute that does research for the government, has built a transform model. And this transform model is there to show basically politicians, government people, but also regular Joes like you and me, what we could do in order to become, carbon neutral. So in essence, if we look at their transform model, they basically say, okay, by 2050, 71% of all our energy, not just electricity, energy, will come from wind on sea, wind on land, and PV. And PV is photovoltaics, solar power. Now, the good news is that 10 gigawatts will become from onshore wind. But the bad news is that they want us to build 90 gigawatts of PV, solar PV, and almost 60 gigawatts of offshore wind. Now, if we turn this around and we make this a 100% renewable strategy, 100% of our energy comes from wind and solar, then we need to build 221 gigawatts of wind and solar. And if you look at what we have today, we have about 30 gigawatts, and that's coal, oil, gas, nuclear, wind, solar, and a smidgen of hydro. So this is a lot. This is much more than we have today. So you see this beautiful picture. This elephant is clearly not in the room, but we do have an elephant in the room. And that's nuclear, because nuclear has been excluded at the climate tables, the climate talks. And that was a really, really unfortunate decision. So if you look at the material requirements for wind, solar, and nuclear in tons per terawatt hour, so basically what we're looking here is at efficiency. How efficient is a certain energy source in basically putting materials to good work? These materials are not consumed, but you need them. You need to tie them up in electricity production. So they're lost for the time being. Now, you can see that nuclear, it doesn't even reach 20 tons per terawatt hour. PV is the worst, almost 160 tons per terawatt hour. Onshore wind is slightly better than offshore wind, and that's because of that's because of the difference in as you can see, zinc usage. Now, this picture alone doesn't tell us everything. So let's look at the TNO transform model, and instead of doing what they did, what we are going to do is we take the 71%, and then we are going to add nuclear first, and then see how much we can, how much materials we can save. So by including 30 gigawatts of nuclear, which is a large number, but it's not less large than offshore wind or PV, we can spare 4 gigawatts of onshore wind, which means a lot of headaches, because many people are up in arms against onshore wind, and 41 gigawatts of solar. Now, why 41 gigawatts of solar? That's because, and I've used a capacity factor of 20%, which is much higher than is actually achieved in the Netherlands. So I'm giving solar the benefit of the doubt here. That's because it's very inefficient, and especially in a country like the Netherlands, which is quite a ways up from the equator, which has a lot of cloud coverage, rain, you name it. So solar is not that efficient. But we are still building a lot of energy in our infrastructure, but it's a lot less. It's 90 gigawatts less than you would have using just onshore wind, just offshore wind, and PV. Now, if you look at the critical material usage of the nuclear scenario versus the non-nuclear scenario, then you can see a stark difference. So this is the scenario that I just showed you. Let's see this scenario. And the other scenario is the one that you saw in the first page. This is the TNO transform model, but then extrapolated to 100%. So these two scenarios generate the same amount of electricity in a year, but the nuclear scenario does it with 800,000 tons of critical materials less. Now, I'm specifically saying critical materials because this does not include concrete, this does not include aluminium, steel, plastic, glass, because otherwise you would see an even bigger difference. So this is not the entire picture, but I'm not going to give you the entire picture because I want to concentrate on copper today. So if I extrapolate TNO's transform model towards the planet, so we're going to do the entire planet the Dutch way. We're going to create an equitable energy system for all human beings on the planet, which means that we divide the number, which means that we create a model that is basically 17, dividing the energy by 70 million, and then multiplying that with 9.7 billion. So that's what you see right here. So this is copper. So I'm going to focus on copper. So we need 50,000 gigawatts of offshore wind, nearly 9,000 gigawatts of onshore wind, and almost 80,000 gigawatts of PV. So in all, if you add this up, this is more than 100 terawatts basically. Now, if you multiply this by the copper usage that we used just now, and we look at the 2020 production of copper was 25 million tons. Now, if you take the 2050 situation and you calculate back and you do it in a linear fashion, which means that you're going to add the same amount of renewables each year until 2050, then you're going to need another 22.5 million tons of copper each year. Now, some people would wring their hands and say, okay, there's no problem. We produce 2.5 million tons more than we need, right? But the problem is, this is already a highly volatile market. There's a lot of commodities being traded because, we use all that copper. So we need to excavate an additional amount of copper in order to get our energy transition done. So that leaves us with almost twice the amount of copper that we need to unearth. And this is something that has never happened before. We have never, ever doubled our copper production in a time of, not even in 10 years. Has never, ever happened. And if we build this 100% renewable world, we are going to need 1.4 billion tons of copper. And there's only 870 million tons of copper that we can unearth economically right now. So we're already punching through, whatever seems to be reasonable right now. Obviously, known reserves can stretch. If we need to dig up more, and the prices go up, that means that the known reserves go up. So this is not to say that this is impossible. This is just to say that it's highly improbable. So just the news that I read today, shortages flagged for EV materials, lithium and cobalt. Now, I was talking about copper earlier, but lithium and cobalt, they have a similar perspective as copper has. And just look at the headline and the subtext. Lithium prices have doubled since November. Cobalt occurs as a byproduct, complicating investment decisions. And nickel is on the verge of a super cycle. It is hype, Macquarie says. So next up, and this is something that I got from Bright New World, which is an Australian NGO, also looking into the same things. What you see here is basically the time it takes to discover a mine and get a permit and start operating it. Now, this is the last column that you see here. So if we look at copper, for instance, then you see that the average delay is 16.8 years. So if the demand for copper rises right now, and there's insufficient mines, and I promise you there are insufficient mines at this moment, it's going to take 16.8 years before copper production can actually catch up to the level that it is required to be. So this is good news for if you're in copper, because this means that, copper prices will skyrocket and stay high. But also you can see the conversion rate. So if you discover 950 deposits and you only developed 353, And the same can be said for instance, the contained metal. So you have 200 and so this is in megatons of copper, right? And you see that in total you have this amount, and then developed against that, which means that the larger deposits get converted into mines, and it takes 16.8 years. This tells us that we were in tremendous trouble. We are already in tremendous trouble. I just showed you that nuclear is a materials. You could basically see it as a way to mitigate the use of critical materials. The more nuclear you use, the less critical materials you use. And that's why we need to add nuclear to the mix, because we are sleepwalking into a problem of epic magnitude. So, and then finally, just to make a bridge to the do no serious harm principle of the EU taxonomy, which is I think it's a secondary consideration, because I think that the commodity side of the problem is much larger than the radioactive waste part of nuclear power. As you can see, this is a picture of me standing right next to a dry cask of low-level radioactive waste. I've also stood on top of a storage container for a high-level nuclear waste. I think this is just not a big problem. You really need to visit COVRA to understand how we store this stuff, what it does. Compared to the copper crisis that is looming, storing nuclear waste is something that we have done for ages and ages and ages. So this brings me to the conclusion: the do no serious harm thing is not something that I worry about that much. Well, I do worry about the way that it is being handled. Luckily, the JRC has says, well, it does not do any serious harm. But to me, the copper issue and the materials usage issue is much more important. You could also, it's analogous to the land usage as well. You can put a nuclear power plant on a piece of land the size of a football field, maybe 2 football fields. And if you want to create energy using wind or solar, the equivalent amount of energy creation, you would need, many square kilometers to achieve the same end. And that's why we need to absolutely add nuclear to the EU taxonomy, and why we need to work on nuclear in the Netherlands. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthijs. Wouter, are there clarifying questions?
2 important questions have been asked. Matthijs, could you say in your numbers, do you also include the grid capacity expansion that might be needed for including renewables and storage backup needs?
No, that's the hard part to model, because that's not even in there. So in fact, if I would do that, it would even make the case for nuclear even better. But I don't do it because there's too many question marks at this moment. I can do it, but that would paint an even grimmer picture, and I don't want to make people. I don't want to give them bad feelings.
Well, and then another challenging question. You saw the benefit of using nuclear because, well, materials are scarce and we excavate a lot on our precious planet. In the conclusion, somebody says, what is that renewables can contribute that nuclear cannot? So why should we go to any use of materials for renewables?
Yeah, the trouble is that we don't have the acceptance needed to do that. So from a purely technocratic perspective, I would say, I would be practical about it. We should use solar on homes, and we should use. I'm a particular fan of solar heating. Wind, not so much. But here's the thing: it's just not. We could potentially practically do it, but it's not if you look from a socioeconomic perspective, it's just not going to happen. So we have to be realistic about it, and that's what I try to do with these presentations. I try to carve out a new niche for nuclear to reestablish itself, and in the end, maybe we will end up saying, okay, in 20 or 30 years from now, yes, nuclear indeed is the best bet. But if you look at it from a societal perspective right now, people are simply not ready to accept that premise. And as long as we keep developing wind and solar, and as long as they help putting a dent in the carbon problem which we have today, I'm going to support them.
Okay, thank you. I would like to invite our all the panel members now to switch on their cameras and microphones. And while you do,
So I'm going to cut the broadcast at this time. I want to thank Thies for giving me permission to broadcast, and I wanted to get his message out there. He's a good friend of the channel, a good nuclear advocate, and so I'm going to cut the broadcast. This is an event that they will have recorded, and you can watch the full event in a I'm going to share it on my Twitter. So go to twitter.com/Carl Alex Pauls, Carl with a K, and you'll be able to see the full discussion, including two other presenters at this presentation on nuclear in Europe's sustainability taxonomy. So thanks for listening with me. I thought it was a really good presentation, and give much love and support to Thies.